The next section that we want to do is the thing or concept, and that's a little bit more difficult to understand, and it's going to require a little bit more honesty on our part than perhaps people or places did. Now, when we look at things, we don't want to highlight every single other noun that's in our document. That's what a computer would do, and that might be helpful in some cases, but we really only want to highlight words that fall under a couple of categories. First, we want to highlight anything that is unique or interesting or raises questions in our mind. What is the document about? What themes or concepts or topics does it seem particularly interested in? And again, be generous as opposed to stingy with this, but you don't have to highlight every single word. The other thing you should also highlight is what words you don't 100% absolutely positively know the definition for in the particular context that the letter provides. What do I mean by that? Well, we use a lot of words in our day-to-day life that we do not actually know the definitions to. Some words we've looked up, we know them, we've used them regularly, but most of our language was picked up by listening to other people speak from the context of the word. And that causes a lot of problems. One, you may be using a word incorrectly or for a very vague, general, similar meaning than the one it actually has. The other problem is that words sometimes have multiple meanings. They have specialized meanings or industry meanings, or they might have changed their meaning over time. A word like happiness, for example, has famously changed its meaning quite significantly over the past 200 or 300 years, and that causes a lot of debate over documents such as the Declaration of Independence for the United States of America. So when you read these documents and you highlight words, if you are at all unsure, not just of the definition of the word, but of the definition and meaning of the word in this particular context, just highlight it. Go and look it up. Nobody is going to judge you, and in fact, looking up a word that you think you know can actually give it a lot more texture and meaning and lead to better insights, more thoughtful analysis, and in the end, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to understand the document, not show off how many words you knew without looking them up. So if we turn to our document, I will change my highlighter to cyan, or that sort of blue-green color, and I will go through the entire document and highlight anything that I'm not sure of or that I think is an important theme or concept that I want to look more information into. So now that I've gone through this document and I've highlighted some of the terms that I want to look up, there's a lot of different types here. So things like steamer and station, these are words that I am very familiar with in terms of the mail steamer that is going on throughout the entire British Empire, taking the post. It probably just means steamer as in steamship, but since he uses the definite article the, it's something I kind of want to look up. Is it a particular steamer, a ferry between their two lands, their two provinces? And I want to make sure I fully understand what he's referring to. Things like material effect. Again, that's a turn of phrase I use all the time, but does it have a more specific meaning in 1865 when this letter is written? Then there's some things like the convict question, the Canadian movement, and the quieting laws. Again, I have a general sense of what these mean based on my basic understanding of Canadian, British, and New Zealand history, but I want to make sure I'm using them exactly the way they would have used them at the time. And in fact, the term quieting law is something I only have the vaguest recollection of, and I will particularly want to look that up. Other things like country farm for a governor, while I understand all of those words, I'm not really sure what he means by this in terms of the law. How is the governor going to get a country farm? Does he mean the governor's mansion in sort of a modern day sense? So all of these things are things I want to look up and make sure I know the definition or what they're referring to in this particular document. Now that we've put in our various information for people and places, what we want to turn our attention to are things, abstract and concrete. But where do you really begin with these? Well, one of the most straightforward places to look is the dictionary. Do we really know what this word or this phrase actually means? Now, it's pretty bad practice to just use a dictionary definition in an essay as Webster's defines, but it's a good place to start, especially if your dictionary has a couple key features. So, for example, if I use Lexico, which is powered by the Oxford English Dictionary, I type in carte de visite, which is a French word that I have a pretty good idea what it means, but I have learned it entirely from hearing other people use it, so I'm actually going to look it up. Now, this says US or UK dictionary for English. I'm going to use UK because as a citizen of the British Empire, that's more likely to give me a helpful definition. Samuel Revens being a citizen, that is, not myself. I look it up and I find historical. So this gives me a good sense that this is a previous definition of this term. A small photographic portrait of a person mounted on a piece of card. Mid-19th century French visiting card. And I can listen to it as well to make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. Now, this is very helpful. It gives me a sense of what it meant and that this is the historical definition of it. In other cases, it would be really useful if I had an etymology of a word. Sometimes if you understand the original French or Latin or Greek that a word came from, it can give you a little bit more insight into what that word really and specifically means. But in this case, this gives me a good sense of what this is. I kind of knew it was a business card, but that gives me a bit more information. If you weren't able to get a full and clear understanding of the origin or history of a word from the dictionary, you can also look to the Historical Thesaurus, which was put together by the University of Glasgow. Now, the Historical Thesaurus allows you to search for certain words, and then it'll give you not only the synonyms of that word, the way you would a normal thesaurus, but it'll put it into historical context. So what are the synonyms for that word at a particular moment in time in the English language? So if we look at our document, there's a couple of words we could look to, but I think the most useful one for this particular case is down here, a large domain, costly residence, and country farm. Now, for me, all of those things seem to talk about similar or very closely related ideas, and I'm not quite sure the distinction between them in 1865. So I'll go to the Historical Thesaurus of English, and I'll type in domain. And when I look it up, there are lots of different ways the word could be used. Use of drugs, relative position, action, perception, power, rule, or government. But these last two seem the most relevant to me. Legal right, a legal holding, a feudal holding, or fief. The same is true of legal right, tenure of property, a freehold. Tenure from the crown domain. Now, both of these have to do with the holding of lands, the holding of territory as part of a legal right. And if you look at the dates, 1601 or 1425 to 1630 and 1876 history. Now, I think that there may be some difference between these terms and how they're used, and the first one seems to match the dates a little bit better for me. So if I click on that, it'll go down to where this is fitting within sort of the hierarchical categorization of words. That is to say, you start with very similar words, a big, broad category, and you narrow it down to more and more specific words that have closer and closer meanings to each other. So land retained by lord, inland, domain, or domain. So that really makes a lot of sense. If we look up a little bit further, we can see the more general categories, a feudal holding, a lease or wardship, and get a sense of when these terms are used. And since domain seems to be in use from 1601 to the present day, I'm going to go with that. So in this case, a large domain, the domain is the land or the territory, the costly residence must mean the house, and the country farm would probably be his means of subsistence or additional income from land that is being farmed for either agricultural produce or maybe pasture. So now that we have a sense of what that word means, we can look for something that has a very specific meaning, something that a dictionary definition or even the historical thesaurus probably wouldn't be able to help us with. And my example for that is right here, the quieting law. Now, the quieting law is something I have a vague recollection of what it refers to, but my recollection is in regard to colonial North America. Now, it's probably referring to the same thing, but it's important I make sure because colonial America, 1760s and 1770s, is very different from New Zealand 100 years later. So where we can go look first of all is Google Books. Now, why Google Books and not Wikipedia? Well, Wikipedia tends to bias terms in how they're used in the present day as opposed to how they were used at the time. And fortunately for us who study British history, Google Books has digitized lots of parliamentary discussions, legal treatises, and just books in general from the 19th century. So we get a sense of how the word was used in other contexts from about the same time. So if we go to Google Books and I type in quieting law and give a little bit of extra information, maybe New Zealand, in order to make it a bit geographically specific, I end up with several different accounts of what quieting law might be. Now, these first few results are all from the House of Lords, and they all have the same text, something that is commonly called in the United States a quieting law. But it doesn't really go on to explain what that is. However, if we go to the New Zealand Journal on page 242, and we open it up to the full page, we find that Mr. Tusnell, in this debate, gives a pretty good definition of what a quieting law is. And what it says is that a quieting law asserts the principle of exclusive right in the legislature which passes the law. But as very great inconvenience would arise from ousting any man from ground upon which he had absolutely settled, the principle adopted there is to deny the private right of anybody to land, but the legislature gives to those who are in actual possession a preemptive right of purchase from the government. So basically what this is indicating is that in order to stop land disputes and people purchasing land from people that maybe not have actual ownership of it, all the land belongs to the legislature, and the people who are actually occupying it can purchase it from the government as opposed to through private transactions. And this is very relevant to what's going on in New Zealand, especially with the oncoming Maori Wars or New Zealand Wars in the 1860s. So if we go back to our original document, we can add a footnote and refer to this document, see Journal of New Zealand, and say that it is the absolute right of government to hold land and settle land disputes through exclusive resale rights. Now that's not a very technical or legal definition, but it gives me something to look at and to remind myself of what it means and a reference to go and find more information if I need it later on.